Now, as you would have seen from the first batch of inductees, Melbourne, Victoria truly has a very rich tradition of journalists and journalism in this city and in this state. A robust press has, over the years, helped shape Victoria and helped keep those in power accountable and honest, at least most of the time. Our next speaker knows the Victorian story inside out. Can you please welcome one of the country's most distinguished and prolific historians, Professor Geoffrey Blainey.
Members of the Press Club, honoured guests. The mass media is being turned inside out in this digital era. The word digital is new to me, I should add. Newspapers especially are struggling, and yet a combination of old and new media, as it emerges, will probably shape Victorian life as much as did the earlier mix of newspapers, radio and television. Victoria's history was shaped by the media to a degree that is now forgotten. Victoria won independence from New South Wales in 1851 after Melbourne and Geelong newspapers had campaigned for it. When the rush to the Victorian goldfields began, the press advised diggers where to go and where to buy picks and shovels, flour and sugar. In that era, the front page of every newspaper carried nothing but advertisements. After the gold miners fought soldiers and police at the Eureka Stockade in 1854, the captured rebels were taken to Melbourne to face trial. Only one was sentenced to prison. He was Henry Seacamp, the young editor of that controversial newspaper, the Ballarat Times. In the origins of Aussie rules football, a landmark was a letter printed in a Melbourne weekly, Bell's Sporting Life. The letter was written in 1858 by Tom Wills, a champion cricketer born in Australia but educated at rugby school. Tom Wills suggested that now the cricket season was over, the Melbourne sportsmen should take up a winter game. He suggested rifle shooting or football. We know who won. Many of the fascinating items in the early Victorian newspapers were simple statements. We have nothing to report. After Burke and Wills set out from Royal Park in 1860 with their camels to explore the continent, the newspapers reported again and again that no news had been heard of them. Economic and political and cultural crusades and charitable appeals too were initiated by newspapers and later by radio and television. Some initiatives shaped the nation. From the 1860s, the Age under David Syme called for tariffs to protect local factories and farms. His was a revolutionary policy because Britain then was the global champion of free trade. By 1908, when Syme died, protectionism was not only Victoria's, but Australia's emphatic policy. We are now seeing it dismantled year by year. For decades, the press, more than the university, was the researcher into national and daily life. In the early 1890s, at the end of Melbourne's land boom, journalists became the serious investigators of financial corruption, trickery and mismanagement. Of course, some newspapers had also fanned the boom in its overexcited phase. 2 generations later, Melbourne journalists investigating the shadowy financier named Kemlani were prominent in the ultimate downfall of Mr. Whitlam's government in 1975. In 2012, another Prime Minister instructed digging journalists to please put their spades away. So far, the media has been a special source of knowledge, though we call it news. The typical Australians, in the course of their life, probably have gained more knowledge from the media than from the schoolroom. The media will remain vital because it is usually a home of debate. Democracy is government by debate, and the debate in a parliament is only one facet of the nation's debate. In the long term, a vigorous democracy depends more on the arguments that take place in the media and in other public places than those debated in the parliaments themselves. If this is true, then the Finkelstein proposal that the federal government should be able to threaten the media is almost as hazardous as the idea that the media should threaten Parliament or even silence it. From the 1920s, radio carried on the main traditions of journalism. From the 1950s, black and white television built on the traditions. The electronic media also added music and drama that magnified the impact of professional sport. The Green Movement, long before it was politically organised, gained enormously from radio and television. They could bring nature to life. In the 1940s, the most popular radio program at 6 o'clock each Sunday evening was Crosby Morrison's Wild Life, with an astonishing 78% of Melbourne's active listening audience. Morrison's voice was soon heard nationwide and in New Zealand and South Africa. Incidentally, it was Sir Keith Murdoch who attracted Crosby Morrison to the Melbourne Herald and its first cousins, Radio 3DB and 3LK. I pay tribute tonight to Dame Elizabeth Murdoch. It's interesting hearing the account of the generations of the Murdochs who've been prominent in the media in this land and elsewhere, to think that Elizabeth Murdoch and Sir Keith Murdoch were married at Scots Church in 1928 by another prince of the media. In those days, the pulpit was one of the media, and the Reverend Patrick Murdoch married the couple. Television slowly changed politics. It tended to enthrone personalities at the expense of serious debate. And yet the media and politics have never been entirely separate. Andrew Fisher of the Gympie Truth in Queensland, James Cullen of the Ballarat Evening Echo, nobody would call a newspaper now an echo, and yet there's something to be said. It means accurate reporting. And John Curtin too were prime ministers who had once been journalists or editors. You've just heard that it was Alfred Deakin who, while prime minister and member for Ballarat, was an anonymous columnist for the Morning Post in London. Sometimes when I pass that wonderful building in Spring Street, which was then the Federal Parliament, sometimes I imagine Alfred Deakin sitting invisible in the press gallery and looking down on the Prime Minister. He sometimes criticised as well he could the Prime Minister. It is curious that one of the momentous political appeals in our history, the appeal of John Curtin for the help of the United States when wartime Australia was in peril, was made not in Parliament. His appeal was published in the afternoon newspaper, the Melbourne Herald, in December 1941. I must conclude. In setting up the Media Hall of Fame this year, the Melbourne Press Club argued that the contribution of the media to the history of this state and nation should be widely known. Every profession, every calling has its defects, and mine certainly has. The media, because it has to meet deadlines and often report controversial events, has perhaps more than its share of imperfections. This is all the more reason why Australians should acknowledge those thousands in the media who, living and dead, did their best. It must also honour the few whose best was superb.
Thank you very much, Professor Blainey. Ladies and gentlemen, can we introduce to you now the next 10 inductees to the Hall of Fame?